So I had a great time playing the Outlast Trials Closed Beta. It was great seeing both Mother Gooseberry and Leland Coil up close. Now there were documents in this beta, so in this video we'll be looking at the documents and building the basis for what the trials are exactly, and what the story is behind the mysterious Dr. Easterman. Please bear in mind that this game is still in development and there will be spoilers for the Outlast Trials in this video. As well as that, with the game still being in development, parts of the lore and story seen in the documents may change by the full release. If you're not familiar with the Outlast story, I've got the entire Outlast story explained up there, so go and check that out if you haven't already. Okay, so let's start with the facility. We don't actually know much about the facility in which the trials take place. We do know that it's called the Sinyala facility, and from this note we can safely assume it's around 85 miles from Williams in Arizona. Do you know what else is around 90 miles north of Williams? The Havasupai Indian Reservation. Do you know what else took place in this region? Outlast 2. Could this be the Sinyala facility? The first document we can see are the minutes of a conversation which took place in Chicago between a civilian called Hendrik Joliet Easterman and a CIA operative named Jameson Lawler. Lawler is questioning Easterman on his attendance at a speech at Princeton alumni in April 1953. His attendance at the speech wasn't really in question here though, it was more the subject matter. You see, in this speech by newly appointed CIA Director Alan Welsh Dulles, Dulles spoke on the subject of Soviet brain warfare. At this point in time, the CIA had been carrying out an operation called Project Artichoke, which used the well-documented inclusion of LSD, hypnosis, and isolation as forms of interrogation. Artichoke itself was the catalyst for, and lead into, Project MKUltra. Anyway, the conversation broaches the subject of the Korean War, or more specifically the fact that 21 American prisoners of war refused to come home from the war, instead choosing to settle and live in communist China. This led to brainwashing being a prominent topic of conversation amongst the civilian population, as it was a front page feature of pretty much every newspaper in the country in July of 1952. Even though Easterman is a civilian, he has an interest and had written works on the German psyche in the lead up to 1933. Lawler explains that they're not talking about thought reform, they're talking about brainwashing. They back and forth about communism and National Socialism, and then Lawler reminds Easterman of his brother taking his own life in the Korean War. Easterman has doubts about the manner of his brother's death, but then Lawler offers Easterman an opportunity to go to Hong Kong. The CIA have captured soldiers from the KPA, the North Korean People's Army, and are holding them as brainwashing subjects. Easterman effectively ditched his previous notion of thought reform and instead switched to focusing on brainwashing techniques. The following month we find that Easterman has a wife, or a partner, called Irene. Easterman says to her in a letter that he feels he'll find out more regarding his brother's death, but that so far he can see no signs of psychological programming. However, he is very impressed by the level of trauma there. Now this is where Easterman's career goes in a different direction. Over a year later, Murkoff joined the party. They procured files on Dr. Easterman, and a week after getting the files they approach him. A man called Olivier Baranchik, who was the assistant director of behavioural medicine at Mount Massive Asylum, writes to Easterman. It turns out that Lawler had been sharing Easterman's findings in Hong Kong with Murkoff. Baranchik mentions the work Murkoff had been carrying out, researching dream therapy at one of their facilities in Los Alamos. It draws similarities to what Easterman had been doing in Hong Kong, and they invite him to meet their researchers in Los Alamos. He's about to meet someone we are familiar with, Dr. Rudolf Wernicke. As mentioned in the entire Outlast Story Explained video, I mentioned that Wernicke was a German scientist who worked with the Nazis and was brought to the US under Operation Paperclip, an operation designed to take prominent and skilled scientists and researchers from potential enemy countries and use them to further their own goals. Baranchik basically tells Easterman that he should accept their invite, and if he doesn't, he essentially knows too much and will be silenced. Safe to say, Easterman accepts. A few months later, Easterman writes that he was warned against talking politics with Wernicke and that they can overlook his past for the sake of the future. Clearly, Murkoff believe that what they are doing here is very important. Murkoff, or rather Baranchik, thinks that Easterman and Wernicke's research can work hand in hand, but every time Easterman asks Wernicke about the intentions for his experiments, he changes the subject onto implications of Germanic folklore. I guess he's referring to creatures belonging to Germanic mythology. A note in Outlast tells us about a creature which appears in nightmares. a creature of Germanic origin called Alp, Mara or Schrat. And this creature formed the basis behind the Walrider and the morphogenic engine, which we know uses dream therapy, which as well is what Wernicke was researching in Los Alamos. In this video, I explain a little bit more about the historical element of Los Alamos and its significance during this time in history. Easterman himself then mentions in the note that he has experienced strange dreams since his arrival. Around 4 years later, Dr. Easterman was sent to carry out research at Murkoff's Sinyala facility. Over those years, he designs trial environments. LATHE itself is an acronym. It stands for Limbic Aggression Therapy, and then I guess Easterman's initials, HE. Limbic therapy involves aggravating the part of the brain known as the amygdala. It recognizes a threat and responds emotionally. Think the fight or flight response. The limbic system is targeted in healthcare to try and resolve trauma, essentially to influence behavior. A similar concept would be one we see in A Clockwork Orange, where the character called Alex is strapped to a chair, given an injection to make him feel sick, and is forced to watch violent films. Then, whenever Alex sees violence or tries to carry out a violent act, he feels ill. However, this is to discourage violent acts and not to reward them. Now, I'm guessing that Murkoff or Easterman was doing exactly the opposite, creating trauma. As mentioned earlier, Easterman was impressed by the level of trauma experienced by the KPA in Hong Kong. In a report to Murkoff's board in regard to personnel at Sinyala, it seems that Easterman's limbic aggression therapy is causing quite the mess. Not that Murkoff care about mess, they care about their bottom line and avoiding potential lawsuits. Due to aggression from the subjects, there were a large amount of injuries and deaths at Sinyala. The author of the report states that nothing they can do can make the trial environment safe. Around 2 weeks after this, one of Easterman's journals states that he believes a man named Scarfiotti is conspiring against him in trying to use Project LATHE's failure in an attempt to sink the entire project. He mentions something called transference. This is where something called the prime assets come in. In his notes about transference, he mentions it being common in therapy, and then he goes on to mention Mother Gooseberry and Leland Coyle. He says that Mother Gooseberry sees Easterman as a proxy to her father. Now, in another Outlast Trials video about Mother Gooseberry, I mentioned that she was a former kids' TV host who suffered at the hands of her father. Her hand puppet was a representation of her monstrous father, and this transference in Easterman being her father's proxy led to her naming this puppet Dr. Futterman, almost like Dr. Easterman. In terms of Coyle, he mentions that Coyle is projecting a parade of murder victims as him, interrogating and investigating them. Another prime asset is mentioned, but as far as I know, we didn't meet him in the trials. But nonetheless, he says that Whitehorn has him mixed up with, in his words, some hillbilly congressman named Wallace. He finishes this journal entry off by mentioning that because they cannot control the prime assets, they therefore cannot fully control the experimental population, something also referred to in the game as X-Pop. He also says that he cannot allow Project LATHE to collapse, as the prime assets will be liquidated. The following day, Easterman amends the principles of how Project LATHE is carried out. He now needs meaningless test subjects, not damaged mental patients or charismatic killers. That he should never be physically present during the trials and should instead be mysterious. This explains why Mother Gooseberry and Coyle projected others as Easterman, because he was more present during the first version of Project LATHE. The day after that, Easterman has a meeting with two other people, the man who he thinks is trying to sink his project Scarfiotti, and a man named A. Bradley Avellanos. He explains his findings, that Gooseberry, Coyle and Whitehorn had too much charisma for the therapy to work. He wants people that they can break down to absolutely nothing. Avellanos says that they already have that in the patients of the Mount Massive Asylum, but the problem is that those patients are full of trauma, which won't work. You'll remember that this is why Wernicke's dream therapy and the morphogenic engine was so efficient at the asylum, due to the fact that these patients had witnessed horror and were traumatized. Easterman talks about making adult-aged children, and that this would save them money by using reagents. He's not talking reagents from a chemical standpoint. He's talking about after these subjects are finished, they can release them into the world and they will be reagents, released agents, I guess, and they'll be released into the culture so they can cause change. 4 days later, Easterman writes a letter to Olivier Baranchik at Mount Massive Asylum. He says that Project LATHE created psychotics, that the aim is to create agents willing to do anything, operant conditioning which focused on subconscious triggers. Much like the 1959 novel titled The Manchurian Candidate, later produced into a movie in 1962, in which the son of a powerful US politician is brainwashed into becoming an unwitting assassin at a certain trigger in a communist conspiracy. He copied in Jameson Lawler from the CIA and tells him about a side effect of Project LATHE. Autopsies of subject had revealed tumor-like growths on the brain. This is the same effect that the morphogenic engine has on its subjects. Lead-based lesions on the brain, similar to the Jane Doe in the Murkoff account comics. In a journal entry from July of 1958, 5 days after his letter to Baranchik, Easterman has hit a wall. The autopsies have revealed no correlation between his trial stimulus and the lesions on the brain, but Easterman has learned of shared visions of the Skinner Man, a nightmare man. Easterman fears that his second version of LATHE won't happen, and that Murkoff will shut it down. However, the following day, Easterman reports a breakthrough in his proof of concept to Baranchik. Once conditioned, they can set predetermined behaviors into the subject's brain, almost like having a devil on one shoulder. Easterman calls it a dark conscience. He then pushes Baranchik to recommend that Murkoff continue to fund Project LATHE. Then, in August of the same year, Murkoff authorized operations of Project LATHE 2. Easterman says that he's going to replace limbic aggression therapy with latent agency therapy. Everything else will remain the same: prime assets, the facility and its trials, and the XPOP. Although the Los Alamos facility's involvement will be minimal, Easterman still needs to share his results with CIA operations MKUltra, MK Delta, and MK Naomi. The next month, in September 1958, Baranchik tells Easterman to share his findings with the paperclip team at Los Alamos. Easterman mentions that people keep talking about a Skinner Man, who Easterman believes is just a nightmare or a subconscious projection of the guards. Wernicke, obviously a fan of dream therapy, believes that the Skinner Man is connected to that. Not only that, but Easterman has heard that the reagents potentially called him the Skinner Man because he is a reflection of him. In short, there is something in the world of behavioral psychology called a Skinner box, an enclosed device used in psychology research. It's actually an apparatus used to study animal behavior. B.F. Skinner himself had two assumptions: that human behavior follows laws, and that the causes of human behavior are something outside of a person, something in their environment. Hence the reagents calling Easterman the Skinner Man. He is a subconscious manifestation of Easterman. Easterman then has a meeting with Scarfiotti, in which he explains the redesign of Project LATHE version 2. He explains that the trials themselves will be the same, with Coyle believing that he is the law, and with Gooseberry living in her make-believe world of childhood joy, and that Coyle and Gooseberry have control over the XPOP, which in turn creates a furnace of violent taboo, which will burn away the personalities of the reagents. Some of you may recognise the name Clyde Perry. Meet Clyde Perry. His picture was displayed in Mount Massive. He was the director of historical refinement at Murkoff. After the reagents were released back into society, Clyde's job was to watch them. Surveillance. The following year, Clyde was doing surveillance on a couple of reagents after they were released from the trials. The first was a subject referred to only as 0877, and everything was normal. They attended church, a baseball game, ate at a diner. They completed a trigger test, I guess to see the effectiveness of their therapy. Perry then surveils a subject referred to as 0946, and Perry describes the surveillance as eventful, with the subject exhibiting strange behaviour. They did some triggers which were fine, but the subject continued to show strange behaviour. As we can see from another note from Clyde Perry, subject 0946 was terminated. This was after they told a group of adolescents that they had extrasensory abilities. The group laughed and ran off. The subject then followed one of the youths home and climbed into their house, resulting in an altercation. Perry then had to shoot and kill the subject. Avianos then writes to Perry and tells him to retrieve subject 0877 and take him to the offices in Los Alamos for further study. What exactly happened to subject 0877, and what made him so special that he needed further study, despite being a successful reagent? Well, another letter from Baranchik to Easterman says that it's rare for any of his subjects to survive this long, and that 0877 has provided a remarkable inspiration to their paperclip guests. I'm guessing that this guy could have been the basis for the morphogenic engine. We can see in the trials that Wernicke is present during them, so it seems that the merging of his dream therapy and Easterman's method of behavioural programming is well underway. But that's it for this one. I can't wait for the full release so that we can find out more about Easterman and his trials, and how everything went in the lead up to the creation of the morphogenic engine. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. But for now, take care, and I will see you in the next one.